Among those who travel on the frozen tundras of Alaska or Canada by dog sled, there's a saying that goes, if you're not the lead dog, the scenery never changes. Which has been adopted over the last 30 years or so in almost every textbook, almost every Barnes & Noble book on business leadership that I've ever seen. That somehow, in other words, if you're not the top dog, the first, the cutting edge, the first to market, your journey is nothing more than a tale of tales. Or as Nike once said, second place is the first loser. That's a tough world to live in, where second place is the first loser. But I fear that that's the mentality and culture that we have created. You know? Pushing us to get the best grades in order to get the best opportunities, the best treatment, the best salary, the best office, the best seat, the best table, the best everything, everywhere, anywhere, in front of anyone we might go. In 1976, when I worked for President Ford, the most coveted thing that you could get within that whole configuration and political machine, the most coveted thing you could get was a name tag for your briefcase that said White House staff. Because no matter where you went then in Washington, D.C., you got seated right away. You see, that's how most of us have been raised to see and understand life. In 1897, a vision psychologist named George Stratton, you're probably familiar with George. George Stratton created a pair of glasses that he experimented with. They turned the world upside down. Well, actually, they turned the world right side up, because if you know how that works, what you see is upside down, and your brain inverts it so that what you see becomes right side up. Did you know that? That's how it works, right? It's exactly how it works. You actually are living upside down right now, but you just don't know it. So in his experiment, he created these goggles because he wanted to see how this would work and how his brain would respond. So he put on these goggles that made everything he looked at upside down. So when he poured a glass of water, it went up. When he saw people walking around, they're walking on the ceilings. And he bumped into things and crashed into things. And this went on for about 3 days. And you know what happened after about 3 days? His brain began to adjust. His brain began to change and alter so that the things that were upside down were now all of a sudden right side up. So he said, let me see what happens if I take these goggles off. And when he did, everything again was upside down. And he went through the same process once more until 3 days or so later, his brain began to adjust and re-invert everything back to the way it was before. Did you know all that? Yeah, it's kind of interesting. When finally he ditched the goggles, everything was once again upside down, and his brain was required to flip them back in order to adjust. Which says that if you find yourself feeling like your world is upside down, or you're at the bottom of the heap, maybe it's not so hard to get out of that funk. Maybe all you need to do is change how you look at things. Change your perspective. Because if our brain can re-invert what we see, how much more so can our eyes of faith if we use them? If our brain can adjust how we perceive things that might just be wrong anyway, because we look at the world with worldly eyes, I wonder what the world would look like if we looked at them more faithfully with the eyes of faith and let God invert what we see and reinterpret our perspectives. Because if Jesus revealed and reminds us of anything, It is that in God's economy, there is no top or bottom, there is no first or last. The last will be first, the master must be servant of all. The Samaritan is the hero. The woman at the well is a somebody. There is no top or bottom, only how we choose to approach and process our experiences. And if in our processing of those experiences we bring God into the equation. One of my favorite Bible stories, and many of you will be familiar with it, it's a story of Joseph and the coat his dad bought at Neiman Marcus and gave to him. This is a nice coat, cut well, $1,000 coat. Anyway, you know Joseph, he was kind of a braggart, kind of irritated his brothers, told them about these dreams of them kneeling down to him, and you know, you can only take it so much and so long, and they said, well, we'd like to kill him. Well, let's do the next best thing. We'll throw him in a well and let some hairy Ishmaelites take him to Egypt and they can kill him. Well, the story goes on that he is sold into slavery and he gets into jail and eventually interprets Pharaoh's dreams and he rises up out of the bottom in the jail to become the right-hand man of Pharaoh. A very powerful position. And of course, as the story continues, there's famine in Palestine, and so the brothers come to Egypt where there is food, and guess who they come before? Their brother they tried to kill, Joseph, only they don't recognize him, but he recognizes them. And of course, he tests them to see if their hearts changed and all of this, and the story kind of ends happily ever after. But the powerful line in that text is that when Joseph talks to the brothers about his response to what they had done to him and how they had tried to kill him, he says to them, you meant it for evil, but God used it for good. God inverted it. God changed it. God brought something out of it, even though it probably took Joseph years to come to that conclusion. But when he did, his heart was filled with grace and forgiveness, compassion and love. You see, God has this upside-down, topsy-turvy craziness according to our worldly standards by which God acts. But God's ways, as Isaiah says, are not our ways. God's ways are better. In this week's text, the Apostle Paul goes to the core of things. He goes directly at the Corinthians in that church. He goes at them because they have begun to pick and to peck at one another about anything and about everything. I was baptized by Cephas. You were baptized by Paul. I can speak in tongues and you can't speak in tongues. Yada, yada, yada. They fought about gifts of the Spirit, baptism, spiritual sophistication, their intellect, all of their degrees and diplomas. All of which, really, if you were going to summarize it, all of which is simply about who's better than who and who should be at the top, who has a place of honor, who is a somebody in that church. That's what they were arguing about. How contrary to the gospel. And so what Paul does, Paul looks at that church and he takes the cross and he says, you don't get it. He takes the cross and places it in the middle of their argument, at the center of their church. This cross changed everything. This cross turned it all upside down and inverted it. What the world thought was the way of winning really was not. It was God's way of winning, or what the world thought was the way of losing, that they would put this Jesus down by raising him up on a cross, was actually God's way of raising up a different vision and a way of living and a symbol of love. You see, Paul says, you don't get it. There is no top or bottom in God's economy. There is only love revealed in a cross at which everyone is welcome. A symbol of disgrace in the eyes of the world, but of agape in the eyes of God. A stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. Counterintuitive to anyone looking through the eyes of the world. But it makes all the sense in the world through the eyes of faith. You see, Rome thought that by lifting him up, they could lower him down. But God said, no. And God used the cross not as a sign of failure, but as a means of grace. But let's be honest, it took centuries to accept this. I mean, we see the cross as a symbol of Christianity, and we just kind of say that's the norm, but it wasn't. It was centuries through which the early Christians were embarrassed by the cross, because the cross was the lowest form of a criminal's death. It took them time to work it through and to absorb it and to adopt it and to make it their own. But when they did, when they saw how the cross changed the world, the cross began to change them. And when they owned it, they realized that the cross said to them, their lives are not, your life is not about being top or bottom, first or last. The cross says your life should be simply about being faithful. Faithful in whatever you do and are. And we nod yes to this. I mean, we say, okay, I get that, I understand that. But what I tell you is the same thing Paul said to the Corinthian church. It's much easier to place that cross at the center of this church than for you to place that cross at the center of your life. That was a real easy thing for me to take it there and put it there. It's another thing for me to take it there and put it here and take it out there. That's a whole different thing. Affirming in worship how God turns things around and upside down and acting out that same belief in the world is a great challenge. You know, last week we read the story of Jesus calling his first disciples, and calling them on the seashore and walking along. They're out there making a living, and he says to Peter, James, and John, and Simon, he says, come follow me. And the text says they immediately jumped out of their boat. They did so with enthusiasm. That's a hard text for me because I'm afraid of the water, and jumping out in any water without something around me is pretty frightening stuff. But they jumped out into the water and they immediately ran to them. And when we read that story in Bible classes over the years, people always say, oh, good for them, what great people, man, it's wonderful. And then I say, well, what about you? And they say, oh, why? Wait a minute, that's a little far-fetched, don't you think? I mean, they had family they should have been taken care of. They had a boat they had an investment on. What about all those fish they left in the net? I mean, they come up with all kinds of excuses and obstacles. It's like me. I don't know how deep that water is. I'm not jumping in. That's crazy. You see, I can't tell you why they were able to do it, but what I do know is that when we read those texts, we find all kinds of reasons for not doing it ourselves, rather than seeing all kinds of reasons and results of what happens when you do it, when you do respond, when lives are changed. As I've said many times, it is the start that stops most people. It is the start that stops most people. So they continue to see life through the eyes of the world rather than the eyes of faith, letting God invert their vision so that things might change. You see, if your brain can adapt, your faith will allow you to do the same. You just have to trust it. 2 weeks ago, those of you who were here remember Bill doing a children's message. And the message was somehow, I'm trying to remember exactly how it goes, so forgive me if I don't get it exactly right, but he had change, and he was taking it out of his pockets, and he was going to have 10 pennies or 100 pennies made a dollar or 10 dimes. Anyway, he was going through all this change thing, and he was kind of fumbling around for some other stuff, and he was looking for a dollar bill, right? And all you found was a 20. All he had was a 20. And so this equation wasn't quite working out, and trying to be kind of cute or smart myself, because he said something like, oh, what am I going to do with this? And I said, you're going to put it in the offering plate when you're done. He very quick-wittedly looked at me and said, I'll do it if you do it. Well, not having a competitive bone in my body, I immediately reach to my wallet, which is where this story really goes, because anyone who knows me knows that I don't carry any money in my wallet. I'd be the biggest disappointment if I was mugged. I just carry no money in my wallet. Because if you carry money, you just spend it, right? So I don't carry money in my wallet. I use my debit card and so forth. My wife would say, why don't you ever have any money? I don't. So I opened my wallet in hopes that I would find something there. And when I opened it, all I saw was a $100 bill. Now, I have almost no idea how it got there, because that is just such an abnormality. But I had cashed a check, and for some reason I had a $100 bill in there. And this is where it gets theological. It has moved way beyond any kind of joking competition, because I know Bill's going to put that 20 in there, and I don't have a 20. And so in a microsecond, my mind is looking for all the ways I can get out of it. And then all of a sudden, in that discussion in my mind is the God moment that says, why? Why do you want to get out of it? Why do you want to avoid at this moment the call of discipleship or sacrifice that's there? What are the things standing in your way? I mean, are you going to miss it that much? Are you going to die tomorrow? I mean, all those thoughts are running through your mind. Oh, I could use this 100 different ways. Oh, ye of little faith. And so there is no ego or bragging here, but there truly was that moment when I put it in the plate, and you know what? It felt good. And I haven't missed it. I haven't replaced it either, but I haven't missed it. Do you see what I'm saying? The cross asks you that. What's the stumbling block? What gets in your way? Why? Because that's the point where God is saying, flip that vision around, invert, turn around, inside out, everything you think is right, because it just might not be. You see, that's a continual challenge we have to ask ourselves, is how do we see the world? Because it's not just about right or wrong, up or down, inside, outside. It's about, do we see the world through the eyes of faith? Because if we see the world through the eyes of faith, it just might turn our vision upside down, or it might, for the very first time in our life, turn our vision right side up. Because the real question here before us in this text in Corinthians, the real substance and the nut within it is, what gets in our way of following Christ? What is our stumbling block? Why do we call that foolishness if God is a part of it? What gets in our way? And if what gets in our way is the demands of the cross, then are we truly and honestly seeing things from the perspective we should and claim to? That's what you got to ask yourself. Because life is really not a matter of climbing to the top or falling to the bottom. Life is really not about that. It's about who do we follow. It's about a tale of tales. And Jesus says, pick up your cross and follow me. Amen. And we will continue our